In Objective 14, we're going to section the body using the major planes of section, the three major planes of section that Dr. Newton covered in her objectives. So we're going to be looking at the body divided by those three cardinal planes of section. And we'll be looking at several different levels and see what the relationship of these organs that we've learned already is in this cross-sectional anatomy. So Objective 14 is our first objective, starting to look at the cross-sectional anatomy of the human body. The first of these cross-sections is figure 1.10 from your Tortora and Derrickson textbook, also reproduced in your study guide. In this cross-section of the thorax, we should be able to identify the pleural cavity. Remember that the pleural cavity contains the lungs, so when we see lung tissue, then it's surrounded by the pleural cavity. When we see heart tissue, it's surrounded by the pericardial cavity. Or more properly, the lungs lie within the pleural cavity, the heart lies within the pericardial cavity. We should then be able to identify the heart, the right lung, the left lung. Now we found the lungs. Why am I showing you the right lung on the left side of the diagram? Well, it's because we're looking up from the patient's feet by convention. So you may need to lay down on a table to prove this to yourself. But if you lay down on a table or have a friend lay down on a table, and then you stand as the observer at your friend's feet, have your friend hold up their right hand, and you'll notice that their right hand is on your left side. So this is just something to be aware of, that by convention, not only in this diagram, but if you go into any kind of visualization science like rad tech, then you'll conventionally be looking from the patient's feet up, and so right and left will be reversed. So once again, here's the right lung, here's the left lung, the aorta, the thymus, and the muscular tube, the esophagus. We don't see the rigid tube, the trachea, because the trachea is already divided up into the bronchi of the lungs, the tubes that are carrying air into the lungs, and so we don't see the trachea, but we do see the esophagus at this level. We'll notice that typically, if we were up more superiorly, the esophagus and the trachea would be running together, but by now the trachea is branched off and becomes something else, and only the esophagus is left, that muscular tube that's going from the mouth to the stomach. So in order to get into the stomach, which is in the abdominopelvic cavity, it has to traverse the thoracic cavity. This also shows you why we use a technique called transesophageal electrocardiography, or TEE, as an imaging technique for being able to see the heart. Because if we run an imaging tube down someone's esophagus from their mouth, then we can see the heart moving around inside the body, and especially see the action of the valves of the heart much more clearly than we can if we try to go through the chest wall. Now we'll turn to the cross-sectional anatomy of the head, and it's not important that we recognize the different structures in the head, but what we do want to recognize in this series of photographs is the different imaging modalities that we use to image the human body and how they look different on these photographs. So at the top, we have a frozen human cadaver, which was sawn through, literally with a saw, and we're taking a photograph of that sawn surface of the head. Next, down in the middle, we have a CT scan of the head. And then finally at the bottom, we have an MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging scan of the head, all in the same plane of section. Which of the cardinal planes are we using here? Are we cutting in the sagittal plane? Are we cutting in the horizontal or the transverse plane? Or are we cutting in the coronal or the frontal plane? Well, we can see from the guide diagram here in the orange line that we're cutting in the transverse or the horizontal plane. Again, sticking with the horizontal plane or the transverse plane, but returning to the thorax, now we've got the same diagram that we saw earlier, but we're comparing that diagram to these different imaging modalities that we're using. From left to right, a frozen section of a whole cadaver, a CT scan of the lungs. We're using a special CT technique called spiral CT here, which is especially useful for visualizing the air pockets in the lungs. And then magnetic resonance imaging of the lung, so we can see the different appearance using these different imaging modalities. The shape of the body changes depending on what plane of section we're using, and so the shape tells us what plane of section that this body is cut in. We've already become familiar with the shape of a transverse or horizontal section through the thorax. A coronal or a frontal section gives the body this shape, and a mid-sagittal or just slightly parasagittal section gives the body this shape as we divide the body into two mirror image halves. Now returning to transverse or horizontal section, but this time more inferiorly, so through the abdomen, we see the liver, parts of the small intestine, the spleen, and one kidney is labeled, but we can find the kidney on the other side as well.